For any homework-related queries, call us at, you can mail us at, info@eduassignmenthelp.com, reach us at https://www.eduassignmenthelp.com. For any homework-related queries, call us at, you can mail us at, info@eduassignmenthelp.com, reach us at https://www.eduassignmenthelp.com. For any homework-related queries, call us at +1 678 648 4277 eduassignmenthelp.com or https://www.eduassignmenthelp.com. For any homework-related queries, call us at +1 678 648 4277 eduassignmenthelp.com or https://www.eduassignmenthelp.com. Problem 6.1, Rational Realizations. A. Generalize Figure 2 of Chapter 9 to realize n/d with nu equals max, deg n, d, deg d, memory polynomials in F2D. Since g, d, is causal, we may assume that d numerator and the denominator by the same scalar. The desired realization is then as follows. Let register of length nu equals max, deg n, d, deg d, sequences dv, d, d2v, d, comma, d nu v, d. By calculating sequences, we can obtain the sequence f, d, equals register input as shown in figure 1 below. The shift v, d, equals u, d, minus d, d, minus 1, v, d. Solving this equation, we obtain u, d, equals d, d, v, d. u, d, v, d, equals d, d. Now by calculating an appropriate linear combination dv, d, d2v, d, comma, d nu v, d, we can obtain the output. N dy d equals n d v d equals d, d, which is the desired input-output map. eduassignmenthelp.com. Any causal rational impulse response g, d, equals memory elements, where n, d, and d, d, are both. D does not divide d, d. By multiplying the scalar, we may further assume that d0 equals 1. Let v, d, denote a sequence that enters a shift d, d. From this shift register we can obtain the calculating an appropriate linear combination of these, d, d, minus 1, v, d, which is fed back to the shift register input is then d, d, v, d, or combination of the shift register contents output sequence d, u, d, d. eduassignmenthelp.com. Figure 1. Realization of a linear system with impulse. B. By a further generalization, show how to realize rational transfer function g, d, equals n, d, slash d, d, with where n, d, and d, d, are polynomial. By calculating n appropriate linear combinations dv, d, d2v, d, comma, d nu v, d, we can obtain each of NYJ, d, equals New Jersey, d, v, d, equals d, which give the n-desired input-output maps. This. eduassignmenthelp.com. Impulse response g, d, equals n, d, d0 equals 1. Realize a rate 1/n convolutional encoder with causal with nu equals max, deg n, d, deg d, d, memory elements. Combinations of the shift register contents of the n output sequences. J n, d, u, d, 1 less than or equal to j less than or equal to n, d, d. This realization is illustrated in Figure 2. eduassignmenthelp.com. Y d equals n d v d causal rational transfer function. Figure 2. Realization of a rate 1/n convolutional, eventually periodic. Show that a Laurent D transform f, d, is an element of f2, d. Laurent sequence f is finite or eventually becomes. Hints. A. Show that if a sequence f is eventually f, d, can be written as f, d, equals g, d, / 1 minus dp. Problem 6.1. A. Show that any causal rational Laurent impulse response of a finite state linear time invariant finite or eventually periodic. We first show that if f, d, is finite, then f, d equals delta greater than or equal to 0, then f, d, is rational because it is f, d, equals delta 0, then f, d, is rational because it where both the numerator and denominator are next. Following hint, A, we show that if f, d, is eventually is infinite and eventually periodic with period p starting, d, equals f0. D plus d gamma p d plus dp p d plus d2p p d plus, where f0, d, is finite with degree deg f0, d. eduassignmenthelp.com. Function g, d, equals n, d, d0 equals 1. d. Convolutional encoder with problem 6.2, rational equals. D is rational if and only if the corresponding becomes periodic. Eventually periodic with period p, then its D transform where g, d, is finite, b, using the results of Laurent D transform f, d, equals n, d, / d, is the invariant system over f2, and therefore must be. D is rational if f, d, is finite with delay del f is polynomial. If f, d, is finite with delay del it can be written as f, d, equals d minus delta f, d, / d minus delta, are polynomial. Eventually periodic, then f, d, is rational. If f, d, starting at time gamma, then f, d, can be written as f gamma and p, d, / equals 0 is polynomial with degree. eduassignmenthelp.com. Deg p, d, p. Since 1 plus dp plus d2p plus equals 1 / 1 minus dp, f0, df, d, equals 1 minus d. Since this is a ratio of finite sequences, f, d, is rational conversely, suppose that f, d, is rational, i.e., f, n, d, and d, d, equals /0. Then we can prove that f, d, is finite or eventually. Using hint, b. Using the result of problem 6 rational impulse response f, d, equals n, d, / d, d, elements. If f, d, is not causal, consider Onsider instead f, d, dot. Since a realization with a finite n number of states, its impulse response must be the initial impulse, the system is autonomous finite state system must eventually cycle through. Problem 6.3, Input-Output Properties. A. If y, d, equals u, d, g, d, where u, d, is Laurent rational, show that y, d, is an n-tuple of formal Laurent. Each rational function g, j, d, may be identified with a convolution of two formal Laurent series, which eduassignmenthelp.com. Minus dp, we can then write d plus p, d, dp. Rational. D equals n, d, / d, d, for some polynomial. Eventually periodic by. 6.1. A. We can realize a system with a causal with nu equals max, deg n, d, deg d, d, memory instead the causal rational sequence f, j, d, equals d minus del instead the causal rational sequence f,